Hi everyone, thanks a lot for coming along today. Just to give you a wee bit of information about the NewBridge project. The NewBridge project was initially based in Newcastle city centre, and the organisation took an empty property there and turned it into artist studios and a gallery space, and it's subsequently moved buildings twice. It moved into the current building it's in, the Shieldfield Centre, in 2021. The organisation's been running for like 11 years now, and it has over 100 artist studios in the building. It has a gallery, a reading room, a bookshop, and it supports artists to develop new work. It runs an arts programme that works with local communities and artist communities, and it runs alternative educational programmes for artists called Collective Studio and Create Disrupt. We're very pleased to welcome Dougald Hine for the launch event of his new book. In 2018, the NewBridge project invited Dougald to hold a workshop in the Bridge Hotel, which asked what hope looked like in a time of increasing despair and on the brink of Brexit and of environmental catastrophe. Not much has changed or gotten better 5 years on after a global pandemic. So Dougald's new book, At Work in Ruins, Finding Our Place in the Time of Science, Climate Change, Pandemics and All Other Emergencies, the book asks, how do we find the paths that lead into the unknown world that lies ahead, and what kind of hope is worth having, and what tasks are worth giving our lives to. So Dougald has founded organisations including the Dark Mountain Project, Space Makers, and most recently a school called Home. He grew up in Darlington and lives in Sweden now. He's collaborated with scientists, artists and activists, serving as a leader of artistic development at Riksteatern, Sweden's National Theatre, and as an associate of the Centre for Environmental and Development Studies in Uppsala University. And we're lucky to have Dougald joined in conversation with Martyn Hudson, who's part of the Anne Moore editorial group examining imagined landscapes. He was co-producer of the ERIS Experimental Research in Spaces seminar series at Baltic 39, and he's an editor of the Routledge Books series, Visual Modernities. The most recent book came out in 2021, which was called Visualising Worlds, World Making and Social Theory. And the next one is Social Ghosts and the Dead of World History Ghost Theory. I want to thank you very much, and I'll just pass over to you.
Makes us sound very posh. I know. And very rarely do you get somebody from Middlesbrough sat with somebody from Darlington in polite conversation.
The night is yet young.
The night is yet young, yeah. It almost sounds like quite despairing, doesn't it? This sort of sense of climate emergency. I'm going to sort of push you on a few questions in a moment, but just to introduce why we're here together, Dougald and I have known each other for many years, partly through a joint love of a number of writers, particularly Alan Garner and John Berger, and indeed that's where we first connected. And we were both involved, Dougald as the main organiser of a conference on John Berger back in 2013. Called Redrawing the Maps, which was a partnership with the John Berger Archive. Dougald and I worked with Tom Overton, Berger's biographer, and both of us have subsequently stayed in collaboration and in philosophical conversation. One of the things about sort of why I was interested in kind of hosting Dougald here is that we're going to talk about really big questions and really grand questions actually about civilizational crisis, about the predicament that we find ourselves within. We're going to talk about the collapse of worlds, rethinking new worlds. What do we sustain or take with us into those potential new worlds of the future? Because we know that our world is ending. And we're going to talk about the death and the decline of modernity and the way in which we can hospice modernity into what we might call a good death, and think about what comes after our current world of modernity. Dougald, would you like to say something about yourself? And as we first met, you were beginning to think about what would become the Dark Mountain Project. From thinking about climate and ecology, and as a former BBC journalist, where did you find yourself in that moment where you were founding with Paul Kingsnorth the Dark Mountain Project?
I suppose Dark Mountain grew out of me meeting Paul, not knowing each other particularly well, but we were reading each other's blogs. Both of us had worked as journalists. He was a few years older than me. Both of us had become disillusioned with journalism as a means of doing worthwhile things in the world, at least for us. Both of us had been involved in environmental activism, and we were also at a point of some disillusionment about that, because we'd both had this experience of meeting or hearing people speak who were prominent environmentalists, and we're talking 15 years ago now. And they would stand up and give the same speech they'd been giving 5 years earlier and kind of rouse a room full of people. But if you caught that speaker at the end of the night over a glass of whiskey, they would admit to being pessimistic to the point of despair. And it felt like environmentalism was in danger of being a church where the priests have lost their faith, but they don't think that the people who come on Sunday morning are ready to hear the bad news. And we had a sense that this was dangerous, actually, because and maybe it's because we were both artists as well. I mean, Paul's probably best known as a novelist these days. I think it was Mark Ravenhill who said in a speech at the Edinburgh Fringe a few years ago, your job when you're on stage in front of a room full of people, and he's speaking as a theatre maker, your job is to be the most truthful person in the room. In other words, if you're an activist or a politician or a teacher or whatever else, you have to make judgments, and there might be a gap between what you feel in your heart and what it's appropriate to say. And that can be entirely reasonable and pragmatic. But as an artist, if there is a gap between what you feel in your heart and what you're saying, then the work will tend to die. The energy goes out of it. And so perhaps for that reason, we were a bit like the canaries in the coal mine of the climate change and environmental movement, because both of us could just feel the way that this gap between what people would say in private and what they would say in front of a room full of people was actually draining the life and truth out of the movement that we had both been deeply involved in. And we didn't know the answer to this, but we said, we think we probably are not the only people who are feeling like this. We think it might be a good idea to create some space where it's possible to talk about our doubts and fears and despair, if that's what you're feeling, not knowing what to do, if that's what you're feeling, without assuming that's the end of everything and without trying to avoid it at all costs. And we also thought somehow that this had to do with art and culture, and that the space that we were hungry for and that we suspected other people might be hungry for was a space that required beauty, a space that required the ability to stay with paradox. When I was working with artistic development at Riksteatern, the theatre in Sweden, I had to sort of ask myself, did I even know what I thought artistic development was or what I thought made something artistic? And one of the answers I came to was that artists are the people with the highest tolerance for ambiguity, the people who are prepared to stay in what looks like a contradiction or a paradox for longest without trying to resolve it into something black and white. And it felt like those were maybe the qualities that were needed. It wasn't as rational as this. It was a hunch when we did it. But I think that's why it turned out in hindsight to have made sense, that in that way we could make a space where it was safe to show up not knowing the answers, a space where there wasn't a rush to action or to making plans, which isn't to say that there's no role for that being part of what later emerges from it, where you could admit to feelings that weren't necessarily seen as helpful in the activist spaces that we'd been involved in. And somehow what we found was a strange sense of hope and coming alive in the spaces that we created after writing the Dark Mountain Manifesto and beginning to publish the journal and running a festival and the rest of it. So I guess that's one way of answering your question of sort of what Dark Mountain, where it came from and what it was for us. But maybe one other bit, which takes it to the book, is right at the end of the Dark Mountain Manifesto, there are a couple of lines which are the bit that I've held closest to my heart from that first attempt to word these things that Paul and I were wrestling with. right at the end, we say, the end of the world as we know it is not the end of the world full stop. Together, we will find the hope beyond hope, the paths that lead into the unknown world that lies ahead.
And why have you been accused of rampant pessimism?
Have I been accused of rampant pessimism? What are you saying?
By George Monbiot, no doubt?
By George Monbiot. George, I'm heading down to his new hometown of Totnes at the end of the week, and I'm waiting to see if he's going to turn up and ask the most difficult question of the whole tour. There's a real and understandable fear that what we were pointing to or gesturing towards or trying to do at the beginning of Dark Mountain was giving up. And that was the accusation. That was the way it was often worded to us, was you've given up, and worse, you're encouraging others to give up. And it was always said as if giving up is automatically always a bad idea. And what struck me was, there's a chapter in this book called How to Give Up. And it's because I knew there was something more to giving up than that. And actually, in recent years, I've found myself in really kind of deep dialogue with people from Alcoholics Anonymous and 12-step fellowships about what giving up can mean and about the lessons of giving up from a really hard end of it. One of the things I say in that chapter in the book is giving up is always giving up on something, even though it may feel like everything at the time. Because sometimes you actually have to make that move of walking away, of saying, I can no longer repeat the things that I've been saying in my speeches for years, because I don't believe them anymore, and I don't know what to do next. And you have to go into that space of not knowing, that cloud of unknowing, because from where you were standing before you made that move, it wasn't possible to see what you weren't seeing. And it's only taking the risk that you may never have another answer, you may never have another next step, but nonetheless, it's time to walk away, that you find yourself in a different place from which you can see the world differently and notice what might have been missing from the seat that you were sitting in before. And in the book, I talk about a journey that I made to Mexico just over 10 years ago to meet a man called Gustavo Esteva, who was an activist and thinker who told this very powerful story that affected me a lot about the 3 times in his life when he had given up on something, walked away from something. And the first time was when he was 22 years old, and he'd been in the 1950s, in the first generation of Mexicans being hired by these multinational companies coming in from the north and telling this big, shiny story of development and how everyone's lives were going to get better. And he was the youngest ever executive at IBM. And at 22, he walked away from that because he said, I saw the reality, which was that all that we were doing was for the benefit of the bosses and not the workers. So then he got involved with a Marxist guerrilla movement. And he said, this was the time of Che. This was the way we were going to bring the revolution to our country. And for a number of years, that was his life. And then one of the leaders in the movement he was part of shot one of the other leaders in a fight over somebody's girlfriend. And he said, it was a revelation to me because I saw the violence that we wanted to unleash on society, and I saw what it would mean, and I couldn't be part of it. So he walked away again. And then he went into the civil service, and by the mid-1970s, he was a senior civil servant running these programs to control the price of basic commodities for food commodities across Mexico. And he said, it was as good as we could do. And in 1976, a new government was being formed, and he was offered a job as a cabinet minister. And he walked away from that as well. And he said, I couldn't explain to my friends, I couldn't explain to myself why. I just knew from what I'd seen already that there was always a gap between how the world looked from where the government was and how it was for the people on the ground. And that these beautiful schemes that we were creating, there was something wrong with them. And so he went and worked at the grassroots in the barrios in Mexico City for the next 2 years with these movements of indigenous peasants who were arriving on the edges of the cities, self-organizing. And he said gradually over the 2 years, he began to almost go mad because he was very academic. He was, he'd won the Mexican National Economics Prize. And so he was reading in every discipline he could find to try and make sense of what he was experiencing and learning in these grassroots activist movements of landless peasants. And he said, there was something in the lives of my friends and the people I was working with there that wasn't in any of the literature or any of the political analysis. They were happy in ways that no one wrote about. They knew things about how to make life work, and they were only ever described in the literature in terms of what was lacking, in terms of their poverty and deprivation and the things that they needed. And he said, in the end, I had to choose between what the academic literature was telling me and what I was experiencing in the movements I was part of. And he said there were only two things that saved him from going mad when he took off the lenses of the academic view. One was the memory of his grandmother, an indigenous woman, and the stories she'd told him in the marketplace in Oaxaca when he was a kid. And the other was reading this man, Ivan Illich, who was the one thinker he could find, who wrote about the world in a way that when he read these books with his friends and collaborators in the movements he was part of, they said, yeah, that's how it is. And so Gustavo was the person who taught me that sometimes you need to give up without being able to explain why, without being able to answer your critics, because it's only when you've walked away and then traveled some way with where you find yourself that you might begin to have some answers worth having.
Mm. And in some ways, I mean, it's that sense of, we are in the ruins. We're in the ruins of concrete brutalist modernism as we speak. We've got to think about what do we salvage from the wreckage? What do we take with us? What do we abandon? What do we relinquish as we enter these new worlds? But could you just unpack what you mean by modernity?
So many stories have been told about modernity. My friend Vanessa Machado de Oliveira, who is an amazing woman from Brazil, she's an educationalist. She teaches now at UBC in Canada, but she did her undergraduate studies in evening classes whilst working 3 jobs as a teacher in the daytime in Brazil. And she wrote this brilliant book, without which my book wouldn't have been possible. Her book is called Hospicing Modernity. Hospicing modernity as in, allowing it to die well, not trying to save it at all costs, not pretending we can make it sustainable, not trying to bring it down or have some kind of revolutionary moment, but recognizing that it is in a slow process of ending. And she always says, modernity is ending within and around us. It's not a they over there whose fault it all is. Modernity is something we're all entangled with in different ways, though some of us have benefited from it far more and some of us have lived the costs of it far more. So when I talk about modernity, I say the simplest way that I can name it to you is modernity was that window of time in which for certain people in the world, it seemed to make sense to identify by how close we are to the future. People have always known that in as much as we talk about linear time, we live after our ancestors. We're closer to the future than them. But only, maybe about 300, 350 years ago in places like Paris and certain other European cities, did people begin to think in a way where they identified as moderns. And then this idea of modernity began to be born. And I say modernity was that window of time within which our proximity to the future seemed like the most important and therefore defining thing about us and our ways of living and our societies, and also a natural direction in which to look for hope. And so modernity began when people began to think about time. Some people began to think about time in that way, and then the results of the projects that they were involved in began to reshape the world and touch the lives of more and more people. Modernity began to end when the future became more a source of anxiety than a source of hope, which really I think we can trace back half a century. And so shall I read a little bit from one of the chapters that touches on this, Martyn?
Please.
All right, so this is from a chapter where I'm talking about some kind of recent political attempts by people on the left to try and get modernity working again, to try and reboot the future as a direction of hope. In the summer of 2019, my family spent 2 weeks at Newspeak House, an ominously named institution just off the top of Brick Lane that is home to the London College of Political Technologists. One night, I came downstairs after putting my son to bed and found a book launch underway. The book was Fully Automated Luxury Communism by the British journalist Aaron Bastani, a manifesto that was among the wilder expressions of a wider tendency on the left in the decade before the pandemic, an attempt to reboot the future as it existed for a while in the high moments of industrial modernity, as a vessel for collective hopes underwritten by the promise of technological progress. This tendency starts with a recognition of something real enough, a widespread feeling that the future doesn't work the way it used to do. You can trace this back to the 1970s and the postmodernists of Paris retreating from the streets to the seminar rooms behind a cloud of intellectual squid ink. The same cultural mood found a pithier expression in the Sex Pistols' No Future. By the 1980s, in the era of Thatcher and Reagan, the future was no longer a shared promise, but a bet that each of us was meant to place as individuals on the housing market or the investment in personal earning potential that a university education was now understood to represent. This sense that something had gone wrong with the future hung in the air for decades, but it took the fallout from the global financial crisis of 2008 for it to crystallize in public consciousness. Remember those surveys, which I talk about at the beginning of the book. Remember those surveys from across the Western countries in the early 2010s that showed large majorities convinced the coming generation would have it harder than their parents. As the decade went on, this darkening mood found political expression on both sides of the Atlantic. As Anthony Barnett points out, the most important words in the slogans "Take Back Control" and "Make America Great Again" were back and again. Against this background, the desire to reboot the future starts with an acknowledgement that something has gone badly wrong, but it treats the failure of the future as a mistake or a temporary loss of faith. Within the logic of modernity, the future is indispensable, the true north around which we are meant to find our political bearings. Yet the oddly nostalgic quality of the resulting proposals, their tendency to reproduce the aesthetic of 1950s sci-fi with flying cars and hoverboards, or to invoke the spirit of Kennedy's moon speech, should be a clue that that map no longer fits the territory. So I guess what I'm saying is that in some important sense, it's not that there's nothing left to happen. It's not that there's nothing worth working for, but the future in that sense that once worked as a thing that you could stand up and make a speech and appeal to and gather people together and build projects like the National Health Service or whatever it was, that doesn't work the way that it used to do, and it's not coming back in that way. And there's one person who helped me find my bearings with this, who I quote near the beginning of the book, an Italian philosopher called Federico Campagna. And he says, sometimes you are born into the end of a world. This is a thing that happens. It has happened before. Other worlds have ended. Many worlds were ended in the name of progress and development by the project of modernity and coloniality around the world. But he says, so how do you notice if you've been born into the end of the ending of the world that you were born into? He says, well, the symptom of this is that the future doesn't work, because the story of the world you were born into is coming to an end. And the future, in the normal sense, is an extension of the story that you're already in. It's a projection into the future that makes sense according to the logic and promises some form of continuation of the world you were born into. And when it's been your fate to be born into the ending of that world, then it doesn't sound convincing anymore when people tell stories that are about a future that is somehow an extension of the present. It rings false. So what Campagna says is, so what do you do if it's your discernment that you were born into the ending of the world you were born into? He says, well, you can stop trying to make sense according to the logic of the world that is ending. You can worry a bit less about that. And you can start trying to create good ruins. Because the world that is ending will leave things behind. It won't vanish without a trace. Some of those things will be toxic legacies that will be around for tens of thousands of years. We know that. But there will be other things that are its legacies, other ruins that it's left behind. And you can do your work in the world wherever you find yourself with one eye to the fact that the things you're involved with will become the ruins out of which the people coming after you are going to have to make lives worth living. And there might be ways that you can contribute to the possibilities of there being lives worth living in the world to come without having a big plan or design or promise about how that's all going to work. Again, Vanessa Machado de Oliveira from Hospicing Modernity, she always talks about presently unimaginable futures. And it was a couple of years of our conversations before I fully grasped what she was getting at there. But what I understand by it now is she's saying the futures that are worth working for, the worlds that could be in times to come, are not anything that we can imagine from here. Because in order for them to become imaginable, we will have to be changed, not least through a lot of loss, through a lot of having called into question who we thought we were, where we thought the world was heading. And, you know, this is all happening around us now. This isn't about something down the line. We're already living in really hard times, and they're going to continue to be and get harder. But within that, we are going to be changed. And there are things we can do to enter into that process of change rather than resisting it, that we might be stripped of some of the entitlements and assumptions that we had. We might become the people who are capable of imagining and contributing to presently unimaginable futures.
I mean, that's really, to start backwards, what we've got is a moment where we're thinking about the salvage. We're thinking particularly about what artists might leave into the world, in that world of ruination. We're thinking, again, about what we have to relinquish. We'll think from the future backwards about some of the things that we disentangled ourselves from, and we'll see that we didn't need those things in the first place. And also we'll be able to disentangle the lost threads of stories, of peoples, of communities who were subjugated by that relentless process of modern transformation, industrialisation, ecological catastrophe, from the margins. And all of this fundamentally is coming back to one thing, isn't it? It's about telling stories. So how do we fabricate? How do we fictionalize? How do we see spaces like this, like NewBridge, as spaces of experimentation, autonomy, prefiguration of the new social forms and worlds of the future? So telling stories about that kind of mythos and mythology that we've inherited from our ancestors become part of those new worlds and those new formations. And why is the storying so important? Why do you act as a storyteller in the face of, why don't you just accept the data, the science, Dougald?
Yeah.
Why are you not interested in accelerating industrial progress? You've given up?
Well, there's a speaking of storytellers, the very opening bit of the book before chapter 1 is just called "First There Must Be an End." And this was a line that came to me. It was a poet in New York, John Paul Davis, who sent me this when I was near the end of writing the book. He sent me these lines from a novel that I went away and read by Ben Okri. It's a novel called The Freedom Artist. And there's a moment in it where a father is talking to his daughter. And he says, "In these times, all we can do is be a sign. We have to help to bring about the end of the world. And we have to do this," he goes on, "so that a new beginning can come. But first, there must be an end." And in a sense, that's true of all storytelling. I mean, John Berger, whose work was one of the things that drew us into dialogue in the first place, has an essay called Death's Secretary, where he says, all storytellers are death's secretaries. Something acquires the shape of a story once it has an ending. And there's also a sense in which modernity has been particularly bad at endings. Modernity has wanted to be a sentence with no full stop that just goes on and on and on, and that's been part of its definition of progress. And, I don't know if this is an answer to your question, but actually, I feel like maybe I should read the most hopeful, the most optimistic, the most cheery passage in the book.
Let's do cheerfulness.
Let's do cheerfulness. So this book was nearly called The Kind of Hope Worth Having. And then my American publisher said to me, you can't have hope in the title. And we had this conversation about this, and I realized that there is a kind of burnt out quality to the language of hope, particularly in North America after the Obama years, sadly. And anyway, so this is the most cheery bit in the book, but it relates to modernity and its difficulty with endings. And this is a slogan that I put up as the first slide in a talk to students in Uppsala, where I live. We are all going to die. You, me, everyone who either of us ever loved, our closest families, everyone who might remember our faces or our names, all of us. We're all going to die. This is not an apocalyptic prophecy. It's only to state the quiet fact of our mortality, the undramatic reality of personal extinction that waits for each of us, sooner or later, somewhere down the road. Yet many of those who study or work with death have come to the conclusion that there is something strange about modern Western societies and the way they handle this reality. The Canadian author, Stephen Jenkinson, who worked for decades with patients approaching death, suggests that North America has become a death-phobic culture. Across the developed countries, there seems to be a difficulty in facing death that sets our current ways of living apart from the ways in which people have lived in other times and places. When I look at how we get stuck over climate change, the dead ends and desperate manoeuvres, the outbreaks of bleak certainty or shiny, groundless optimism, I can't help thinking there is a connection to this culturally distinctive difficulty in facing the thought of death. We swerve around these black holes rather than look at them directly. Anything is better than slowing down, sitting with the darkness, and allowing our eyes to adjust. Those among us who have done the most to sound the alarm are not free of this entanglement. Western environmentalism is haunted by the same ghosts as the death-phobic culture out of which it came. How could it be otherwise? When we look at that famous image of the Earth from space, our sense of its fragility is overlaid with projections of an unreconciled fear of our own deaths. When we talk about extinction, we call up the shadow of another ending, smaller, yet seemingly total, voiced, aptly enough, in the words attributed to Ayn Rand. When I die, the world ends. I don't mean to charge my friends in the environmental movement with Randian solipsism, only to own that we come out of a culture whose attitude to death is skewed enough to make such a statement thinkable. To see and speak clearly about our present situation, I need to start with death, to come to terms with my own mortality, not as an inconvenient fact, a thing to try to avoid thinking about, nor as a world-ending event, but as an intimate knowledge, a mystery that makes me who and what I am. Knowing that the body in which these thoughts are cradled will someday be burned or buried, that the world will close quietly around my absence, that this is the ordinary course of events, releases me to be vulnerable and dependent as I always was, a part of processes whose time is vastly other than my own. And I think we need spaces that have the kind of invitation that I'm trying to make when I write like that, in order to be with what we know about a thing like climate change, so that it's no longer arm's length facts or plans being made based on a sense of kind of desperate panic in relation to those facts, but an embodied knowledge, something that comes into us and changes us and calls us into question, so that we begin to become other than those people from the death-phobic society that many of us were born into. And
we need to grieve for that world.
Yes.
And the process of hospicing is about a grief, for a huge amount of loss.
Yeah.
that we are facing catastrophes. But this modernity and its abandonment and its ruination is a recognition, that to be fully human, as Chris Smage says, wasn't, in your book, isn't about those who've been left behind by modernity. He says it's the slave of the Black Atlantic and the Filipina maid, who've lived modernity just as much as the Silicon Valley millionaires. This is the nature of modernity.
No one is living in the past.
Exactly.
The lives of all the people in the world today are tangled together by processes which some of us benefit from and many pay the costs of. And there's a sense, another quote that I use several times in the book comes from these anthropologists, Mario Blazer and Marisol de la Cadena. And they say these conversations about the Anthropocene, which is the name that is given to this new geological epoch that is the consequence of human activities. They say these conversations start from cities like Berlin and London and Stockholm and New York. From other places in the world, listening to this, it can sound a lot like the world of the powerful is becoming conscious for the first time that it too could end, after having gone around the world ending so many other worlds and calling it progress and development. And that's been like a compass bearing for me, actually, that passage from Blazer and de la Cadena.
And it's also as well, when you think about what you call in here a death-fueled economy, in terms of we're talking about fossil fuels out of deep geological time, which are still fueling that dominatory modernity. And again, thinking about, as we can't possibly hope to imagine, we're not in that place to imagine as a species, but thinking about those worlds beyond, thinking about our stories from the past, are ways again of grieving.
And thinking about how we find the tasks. I mean, it is called At Work in the Ruins, and the point of the title is there is work to be done. I say, especially in the last third of the book, there's a kind of note that I keep sounding, which is, there are people, some of whom would see themselves as not coming from a particularly different place to me in relation to climate change and environmentalism, who, when you listen to them, they have this kind of black certainty about how the story ends. And I have a chapter where I'm quite critical of Jem Bendel's deep adaptation paper and some of the conversations I found myself in as a result of that work. And what I say is, we don't get to see the end of this story. To the extent that it makes sense to speak of it as a story with an ending, none of us is going to be around then. This is going to be ongoing. It's a long journey that we're just somewhere along the way of. We're one link within a chain of generations. But also that just because we don't get to know how the story ends doesn't mean we can't play our part within that story. And I end the book with a kind of an unfinished list of kinds of tasks that might be worth giving our lives to in a time of endings. And as I say, the first kind of task is to try and salvage the good things that we have a chance of taking with us, because there are achievements of modernity that we would not gladly lose. And to bring that into clarity, not to bundle them up into one big story of progress, but to get down to the granularity, to look at what is it in practical terms that has made possible the transformations of infant mortality and maternal mortality that are surely among the greatest achievements of modernity. What knowledges and practices can we take with us into whatever world we find ourselves in from that? So that's the first kind of task, salvage the good that we have a chance of taking with us. The second one is mourn the good things that we may not get to take with us. And part of the work of mourning, and we all know this when we've been through times of grief, part of the work of mourning is to tell the stories. And those stories can travel with us. And some of those stories may turn out to be seeds in worlds that we cannot imagine. The third kind of task is a task of discernment, to notice the things that were never as good as we told each other they were about the ways that we have been organising life in modern societies. To notice the things that produced loneliness and dependency and mistrust and created spaces to which it wasn't safe to bring so much of what we're capable of as human beings, because those spaces were dominated by the logic of the state, which is, I'm doing this because someone who has power over me has told me I have to. And the logic of the market, which is I'm doing this because someone's paying me and I need money so that I don't become homeless next month. So much of our societies has been dominated by those twin logics of the state and the market that many people have had very little experience of what human beings are capable of when they come together for other reasons. Now, some of us, for one reason or another, in churches or in squats or in community groups or artists' collectives or whatever, have had a bit more experience of what humans are capable of when we come together for other reasons. That can be among the seeds for worlds yet to come. But there is a thing where, the philosopher Hegel said, the owl of Minerva flies at dusk. The owl of Minerva is the goddess of history. There are stories that only come into view, things that can only be recognized and told as stories when you reach the ending, that were hidden during the high times when it all worked. And that is true of the institutions and structures and ways of thinking of modernity, that we can recognize things that were never as good as we told each other they were, and that we're actually being given a chance to walk away from. And the fourth kind of task that I've got so far is look for the dropped threads from earlier in the story, the things that have been marked as old-fashioned or obsolete or inefficient, that might be surviving at the edges or below the radar and might turn out to make all the difference for our ability to make lives worth living together in the times to come. So that's, those are four kinds of task, and each of them, there's many different ways you can be doing it. None of us is going to be dedicating our lives to each of those four tasks. We don't even have to agree as to which are the things that can be saved and brought with us and which are the things to be mourned. It's not worth wasting time on pretending we know what it is that's going to turn out to have made all the difference, because we don't. And we'll be gone by the time it's possible for historians to look back and tell the story of what it was that made the difference in the 21st century. But that doesn't mean that we can't find work that's worth doing, starting from the places and communities where we find ourselves today.
And perhaps we can talk about those stories and histories and practices from the margins and from subaltern communities as we move into questions and discussion.
Shall I just read a couple of lines more from the book, from the final section? Maybe this will seed some thoughts or questions. Around the time the 2018 climate movements emerged, I began to notice a dark certainty in some of the voices speaking to us about the existential threat of climate change. I'd been talking about surrender, and I suspect that these speakers would see themselves as unillusioned, surrendering to what we know and what we have good grounds to fear about the depth of the trouble we're in, abandoning the vanity of imagining that we can take control of and manage the processes of this living earth. Yet what I hear is that note of certainty, of knowing how the story ends. And this feels like the last thing they're holding on to, that stands in the way of what surrender could mean. So my encouragement would be to surrender, yes, but to surrender to the mystery, not the certainty. Set a place at the table for the stranger who might arrive at your door, even now, even in a world which has forgotten so much about hospitality. So I guess that's sort of the invitation that I'm bringing as the book comes to an end. So hopefully we can be hospitable to your questions or thoughts or reflections.
Radical conviviality.
There we go.
I'm finding my head being turned in two different directions. Part of me really warmed to what you were saying about alternative communities, so churches and XR groups or whatever, where groups like this, where people have come together, and that dynamic of I'm here because you paid me, or I'm staying because if I don't, you'll tell me off if I don't go, kind of thing. And that's beautiful, that kind of space where that can happen, and a sense in which, as we look with some measure of hope, that as we're looking, building that community, the people around us right here, the people we're touching right now, is going to be absolutely crucial. But there's part of me that is still asking the question of whether there is any point in trying to beat down the doors of power, not literally, obviously, because I'm a non-violent direct action person, but actually stand there outside Parliament, actually trying to bring change when it almost feels like you're saying, well, that change is coming, and that change is going to, we can't predict that. So it almost feels disempowering. Am I missing something?
No, thanks for asking that. That's useful. I think that might draw something out. So firstly, I think often when we get into conversations about these things, there's a point where someone says, so, what should we do? And often we assume that question has a sort of single answer or a coherent project as an answer to it. And I think part of what I'm trying to gesture towards is that actually that might be a question that we have to answer, for ourselves, starting from where we find ourselves, rather than for once and for all. That doesn't mean as isolated individuals. It means in relationship with those we find ourselves alongside. And there's a lovely quote from John Berger that I use in the book that speaks to that for me. But part of the hospicing thing, rather than either trying to save or trying to overthrow, it's not trying to kill modernity. Hospicing, trying to give it a good ending. Some of the work of giving it a good ending definitely involves occupying positions inside existing structures and trying to do that well and with kindness, and making pockets within those structures that work to different logics than the ones that generally tend to dominate them. And there are definitely, at the end of the book, I talk about being very struck by how Extinction Rebellion and the Gilets jaunes, the Yellow Vests movement in France, actually showed up on the streets of London and Paris for the first time on the same day in November 2018. And there was a rather strange kind of symmetry of the aesthetic between the sort of fluorescent vests of the French protesters and the aesthetic of XR, and the similarity of the tactics in both cities. What people were doing was getting onto the street and stopping, interrupting business as usual by bringing the city to a halt. And it would be easy to just see them as kind of opposed to each other, because the initial trigger for the Gilets jaunes was the introduction of an increased tax on petrol in the name of doing something about climate change. But I actually think that where those two things overlap, where you have movements that are able to speak to loss and longing, and the gap between the big story that has been told about progress and the experience of more and more people's lives, there's a lot of potential in that. And it was very striking to me, looking at the demands that came out of local groups that formed during that moment of the Gilets jaunes in France, how many of them were actually making demands for citizens' assemblies, which is the same as the third demand of XR. And there's a little bit in the book, there's a chapter where I write about the 2018, 2019 climate movements that are still obviously ongoing and popping up in new forms, where I talk about the language of climate emergency, and how when the language of emergency is used in politics, that means less democracy. It means the suspension of rights. And it was quite a peculiar thing to have this eruption of organizing to demand a declaration of emergency from states and local governments and so on. And I'm not saying that that means it's wrong, but what I wrote with a friend of mine, Duncan McLaren, some articles during that time where we were saying, if you're going to invoke emergency politically and you don't want less democracy, then you need to articulate what emergency democracy might look like, what the more democracy path might look like. And I see movements like XR and things coming out of that as, in their own ways, trying to explore that and trying to figure it out. And so I'm definitely not saying abandon existing institutions. One of the things I'm very interested in doing is bringing together quiet conversations between people inside and outside of institutions, and creating spaces where it's possible for people to speak openly about what they see from both sides of that line. So yeah, there's not a single kind of this is what we should do and this is what we shouldn't do coming out of what I'm trying to say. So thanks for drawing that out a bit more.
Yeah. Hi, that was really really insightful and very interesting. I'm just kind of following up a little bit on that question about this notion of hospicing modernity and allowing it to have a good ending. What, in your view, is a good ending? What does it mean, in your view?
So a good ending might be one in which the damage being done as something ends is minimized or mitigated, it might also be creating the conditions for the lessons that modernity in this case is carrying to be told, for the stories and the truths that maybe modern systems and ways of thinking haven't been able to recognize fully, to come out and be heard in the ending. One of the things I talk about a lot with Vanessa, who wrote the Hospicing Modernity book, is how much of what is helpful in the legacies of modernity has been hobbled by an arrogance that has been structured into the way that these things have shown up. And if we can help them down off the pedestals, we can allow them to be carrying things that continue to be useful and things that are woven into what comes next. So one of the questions I frame at the beginning of the book is, how far and in what form does the work of science survive the ending of the world in which the big single story of science took shape? And I think, part of the book is coming out of encounters with climate scientists who themselves reach a place of despair because of the gap between what the science is saying and what's being done politically, that leads them into the kind of conversations that I'm writing about. So, those are some answers. I'm not sure I think there's a lot more to be explored about what giving modernity or giving anything a good ending can mean.
Perhaps also the ritual around death and ending.
Yeah.
There's something about ritual and practice and work, of marking, of signifying, of mythologizing. That's all part of when somebody as an individual ends. That may be part of the way world ends.
Thank you. Yeah, that's really helpful. I'm thinking as well, I talk quite a bit about initiation in the book, and about how, if modernity has given us these death-phobic cultures, they're cultures where we meet the fact of our own mortality for the first time quite a long way on in the journey of a life. Sitting in a doctor's waiting room or getting a call bringing bad news about somebody close to us. And most human cultures in different times and places have had initiatory practices that have been part of the journey across the thresholds of an individual life, and also part of the journey across the thresholds of the life of a community. And one of the common features that shows up in a lot of times and places in initiation work is a staged encounter with a very visceral experience of the proximity of death. And this has been part of, rituals at adolescence in many cultures. And part of what that's about is that so that you don't meet your mortality for the first time when it comes for real. And in a sort of similar way, I've been talking in various places on this trip with people about how we rehearse for worlds that are coming after, how we practice living without things that may not be around that much longer, without pretending that we're there already. So when I was working in London and we were doing this project called the West Norwood Feast, where we created a community-owned and run street market, one of the things for me that was driving that, or that was kind of at the heart of it, was witnessing this thing where we'd have these volunteers in West Norwood on a Sunday morning, and they'd been working in their day jobs all week, and they'd show up at 6 o'clock on a Sunday morning, putting up market stalls up and down their town centre. And I used to say, well, maybe they always had a secret burning desire to run a street market. But I don't think it's that. I think there might be something else going on, that there is something that happens in that experience of coming together for other reasons that are not wholly governed by the logic of the market or the state, that releases something and gives us an experience of something. And I used to see that as a way of rehearsing for what was going to be needed as things get harder. That the more of us who have had the experience of being part of things that work to a logic that's hidden within the dominant logics of modernity. Again, Vanessa Machado de Oliveira speaks about exiled capacities and inviting these capacities back in from the edges. The more of us who've had those experiences, who know that the story about what it's like to be human that has dominated the spaces of modernity is not the whole of the story, the better chance we're going to have as we have to improvise responses from below as things continue to get tougher. So yeah, I mean, that's just me kind of picking up on what you're saying about ritual and where that connects into some of the strands in the book, I guess.
One of the things, sorry, I know Mike is wanting to come in, but one of the things we don't really elaborate is the relationship to other species in the book, which is...
That was the point I was going to ask, actually.
Right, okay. Well, Mike, just go.
Oh, no, you carry on.
No, I mean, I just think it's really interesting, because we've got to that displacement of the human. We're getting rid of this concept of the fully human, close to the future, as opposed to the not so fully human as not quite so close to the future.
In terms of intelligence, it's interesting because we view intelligence in one way, but I was reading a review of a book the other day which suggested that crocodiles will probably outlive us because who's more intelligent?
Well, it is a sentience, isn't it? The Cambridge Declaration of Consciousness.
The practical thing, the importance of reparation as well across cultures, and I would take that to mean any sentient culture which I would view as plants and animals as well as the global south. That has to be a key thing, surely, in that kind of balancing up of things.
Thank you. Yes, absolutely. I'm thinking now of the image of a mother tree in a forest. When the tree dies, it releases the resources that it's been holding into the ecosystem around it, creating conditions for the possibility of life that were bound up inside that tree until its death. And maybe that could be a powerful image for what the ending of modernity, and as Walter Mignola would say, modernity/coloniality, they're always two sides of the same coin, what that needs to look like in practice, and then we can look at like the different forms in which that release of resources needs to happen as part of the journey. So thanks for bringing that in.
Sorry, Michelle.
I think I'm really struck by this description of modernity as being a description of empowerment, and I think it's really important to recognise that empowerment doesn't sit equally, and it doesn't sit equally globally, but it also doesn't sit equally within cultures. And I think particularly for a lot of women, we don't have that power, and we are the ones who are actually doing a lot of the care and a lot of this restorative work. So I feel it's really important to, not to flatten this stuff, not to kind of describe it just from this slightly monolithic point of view, which is a very modernist perspective, but to recognise that there are really different experiences within it. And I think when people have power, to find ways of sharing that power and speaking, with other beings, other members of society that maybe are not going to always have that voice or always have that sort of position of influence. So, I think that's really important. And the other thing I've been thinking about with activism is just that I was involved in activism in the 90s, kind of environmental activism, and in terms of hope that, all of us engaged in that work in ecosystems which we knew were going to be destroyed and which were destroyed and which had often, scientific, enlightened, however you want to term it, knowledge applied to it that designated those sites as being important, but it happens regardless of that. So I don't think it's only a kind of knowledge system that's doing this. It is the financial system that does it. So that, those things were in a way complete failures, but also really successful because what they did was build community and connection. And think about other systems of kind of communicating and sharing skills and power.
And that was specifically the experience of the Newbury bypass and other spaces.
Other spaces, 65 in Stanworth, the Jesmond bypass up here, Salisbury Hill. All of them had designated sites of special scientific interest, which meant that they had ecosystems of, continental importance. So, for me, that always flagged up an issue of that, we have, even when that kind of rational scientific approach is on side, it's not working. And what's making it not work isn't the science, it isn't the kind of rationality even necessarily. It's often corruption and kind of just very powerful financial and political forces. So That's not a question, that's just like a load of statements.
In many ways, it's reminiscent of, rather than go for the accelerationist highway, we're going for the unpaved trackways, in a sense, and restores that. So there was somebody back before you, Eugene, sorry.
I was struck when you were talking earlier on about taking the positives and building on that, and I was reading the beginning of an article earlier on today. It was an interview with Naomi Klein, who's got this position in Canada, in a university there, but her role is something along the lines of a professor of social justice. So the links with kind of social justice and climate justice being, again, two parts of the same thing. But I was thinking about that of, okay, changes that need to be made, what can be brought forward, what are the things that are worth holding on to, that can be flourished, that we can bring forward. And it was that, again, it's statements again rather than a question. What are those things that we're talking about in these kind of spaces that can be built on that the current system has caused those issues to be in the first place? My immediate thing is obviously you're referring to modernity, to modernism, but I'm immediately thinking sort of capitalism and continuous economic growth and all of those things that don't fit on a planet with finite resources. And who are the winners in that? And who are the majority of people? Who are the losers? And where are those losers, as it were? But what can be learnt that are good things that are going on that can be brought through for that? And it's about sort of protecting and growing and encouraging, and again coming back to those communities, but what is important about that can be brought forward. So those are the crucial things that come into this new world, whatever that is. But those things being the things that are sort of protected and grown and thought about in spaces like this, or whether it happens to be in different communities across the world, because it's a loss of that as well that I think is bearing that in mind too. And I did like the thing you were saying about modernity suddenly realising that actually it's killing itself as well, but it's killed so many other things. I mean, again, this immediately comes to colonialism, racism, white supremacy, all of those things all bound up together. Again, a load of statements, basically, but those are the things that I've been thinking about.
No, thank you both for bringing so many important things into the room in the last few minutes. I was thinking when you were speaking about the experience of the 90s, environmentalism, and as you say, the science not being listened to. There's a thread of that I'm writing about in my encounters with climate scientists, and the sort of disillusionment that many of those who I've got to know in that field have had of the promise that was made when the IPCC was created, was we're building this thing that links directly from scientific research into policy, and if the scientists deliver the evidence, then the action will be taken. And gradually, report by report, the scientists began to realize that the other end of the deal wasn't being kept. And this leads to this sense that the sort of the authority which modernity accords to science is mostly a sham. Science is used as the kind of shiny front for the dirtier machinations of power. And then where does that leave us if we are still stuck with a story that grants science the right to tell us what to do and have to carry all the weight of knowing a thing like climate change? And that's part of where the book goes. But I was also thinking of, on Saturday, we were at Gale in Glasgow, which is a legacy of that 90s moment, because whereas in a lot of the sites in England during the Rhodes protests in the 90s, what you had were these unusual sort of combinations of activists and travellers coming together with local residents in rural villages that were often quite prosperous places. There was another story that happened in Scotland where they were building a new motorway through one of the poorest areas of Glasgow. Yeah, Pollock, that's right, in the Pollock Free State, yeah. And the Gale story is amazing because they say, after that moment of the Pollock Free State, they said, so we've shown them what we're against, now let's show them what we're for. And they're still, and it's not, I love Gale, it's one of my favourite places. It was such a good place to begin taking this book out into the world. And we had a conversation afterwards with some of the Gale team about the challenges. And one of the challenges they said is we're in a place now where there's a lot of people who do have a fair amount of privilege, who are hungry for meaning, being drawn to spaces like Gale. And there are also people who are at the core of what Gale is and why it exists, who are hungry. full stop. And how to navigate, and this is a challenge that's here for you guys who are involved with this space where you are, how we bring together the hunger for meaning that exists within our societies and the actual hunger that exists in our societies, and are aware of the danger that, yes, there are times when it's the right thing to do to have a space for an evening where it's all very verbal, but that space does privilege certain groups of people who are comfortable expressing themselves in certain ways. And one of the conversations we were having there was about, the role of coming together around a common task as ways of bringing people together that don't simply privilege meaning, and that actually put people like me, who were trained to be good with words, in the position of being humbled and feeling our foolishness as we work with our hands alongside people who society says are much lower status than us, but who know how to do things that we depend on and that we can't do. And creating those kinds of encounters in spaces is one part, I guess, of their...
Indeed, solidarity is... Sorry, I'll just take Julie.
Thank you. I was motivated to speak because of what you said, Michelle. What you were describing is, I think, a common experience for many people in the room, and it has been rehearsing for change. And you talked about rehearsing for change, and I think that many of us here in this room have been rehearsing for change. And lots of creative practices, creative and cultural practices, are about rehearsing for change. For me, the work of Boal is a wonderful example of rehearsing for change. So I really understand that. And as you were then talking about food, I began to think about the miners' strike and the women, the miners' wives, who made sure that nobody went hungry during those terrible times. And in fact, our struggles, we need to join up the dots, not just think about our campaigning or our work on environmentalism, on the environment, but about all those issues together. We need to join up all those things together. And while you were giving your presentation, I kept remembering, I have a friend who lives and works in Amazonia, in the city of Maribor, which is one of the poorest cities, and has been really affected by the mega dams that have been built. I hardly dare say this, but I'm a convener for Culture Declares Emergency, the Northeast Hub. We have 3 principles: take action, seek justice, tell the truth. And whenever I say to my friend Dan, come to one of our meetings, he joins many of our meetings online, and he laughs when I say Culture Declares Emergency. He said, we've been calling an emergency for 2 decades and nobody ever listened to us. And so what they're doing now is a project called Good Living, and they are working in their community, recovering ancient knowledge about plants, about medicines, about herbs, about different practices, about the weather, and it's called Good Living. And when I look at what they're doing, I think they might well have already hospiced modernity in his community. I think they've done it already, and they are already on to the next stage. Often the work, and they're dancers, they're musicians, they're doing all different kinds of arts practices. And often what they do is create work about their dreams. And there was a really powerful dream that one of the girls had, which was about being eaten by a whale. And it became this incredibly profound symbol and a metaphor for a lot of the things that were happening to them. I mean, I'm happy to share the contact later if that's of interest. And even though Culture Declares Emergency is about declaring an emergency, it is also about cultural assemblies, about democracy, about people being together and using the arts and creativity to tell stories.
Thank you. I love that part that you said about them already being well into the journey of hospicing modernity. One of the places that I land towards the end of the book is with this very strange experience of being in this room in Brussels with a bunch of people who work inside the European Commission, who had called this sort of basically unofficial conference around climate change, because they had got to the point where they were really freaking out about climate change. And I met this group of people, and they had this kind of black despair, this flat certainty about how it was all going to end. And I was really puzzled, because it wasn't like what I'd experienced in the spaces we'd convened with Dark Mountain. And slowly what I realized was they'd lost faith in the kind of institutions they'd spent their lives working within. They'd lost faith in the promises those institutions make to save the world and fix climate change and build a sustainable future. But they hadn't questioned the theology of their lost faith. They still felt that the world was a thing that needed saving by people like them in institutions like theirs, and they had never contemplated that the agency of what is coming next might not lie with people like them in places like that, might not even all lie with the humans, but that, you know, the worlds to come might not be being built by the people who think of themselves as the ones who make the world work and know how it works today. So thank you for bringing those stories from the Amazon.
What you were saying about rehearsing for the change, so Augusto Well talks about rehearsing the revolution, right? I was just kind of thinking and talking with other people in that half-hour break that we were in a session just earlier doing theatre games, doing forum, talking about forum theatre, and then we came into this space where suddenly I was having to really concentrate and go, oh, now I have to process this intellectually. So it's exactly that process that you were talking about, you know, that language and that way of talking about things and expressing things is for a certain space and maybe can be for certain people, but it doesn't necessarily speak and act in every way. And what you were saying about when you become humbled by working alongside someone in a different way, and I was thinking, but theatre and arts and different, you know, expressive means also do that, right? Also allow us to do things differently and to communicate differently and sit alongside people who might have a very different life experience from ours, or a different perception and different priorities or whatever.
Yeah.
But to find ways of being in community and solidarity and to create something together. And it kind of made me think about also like what can the clown bring into this space of the death of something, and it made me think of I was talking earlier today actually about with another colleague about in Ghana. I was working with a group of young people, many of whom were living on the streets, and we were making a show about a young street boy, and he dies in the show, and we were rehearsing it. And at one point in this rehearsal, everyone disappeared and came back. Suddenly they'd found a dressing up box, and they came in all these mad costumes, and they were dancing around and they were laughing and clowning. And I was like, guys, we're supposed to be rehearsing the funeral scene. What are you doing? Like, this is not the time for messing around. And they looked at me like going, what are you talking about? Like, we're doing what we're supposed to be doing. And I was like, what do you mean? And they said, well, at the funeral of an elder, a man in our culture, in their particular, it's not probably in every culture in Ghana, but in the one that they were referencing, they said that the daughters of the person who died would dress up as him and dress up as his mates, and they would clown them as part of the funeral. So I was thinking a bit what you were talking about before about rituals of death, and like how do we bring in to the ending of something the delight and the wonder of what else could be, which was a bit like that, setting a place for that guest that you don't even know who they are yet. And kind of how can clown and chaos and theatre do that imagining of the worlds that we haven't yet imagined, and open up spaces that people might not have thought about yet, you know? So it's not a question exactly.
I love it. I'm thinking about, there's a book by a guy called Lewis Hyde called Trickster Makes This World. And one of the things that I came to understand from that book was, firstly, he talks about how in modernity, the artist has taken this role of the trickster figure, which is a figure that exists in myths from many cultures. And then he says, in the history of cultures, trickster often plays a special role at times of massive traumatic cultural change. Because, In settled times, trickster is often this kind of part entertaining, part annoying, low status figure within the cosmology of a culture. But when that culture cannot hold in its current form, when the end of its world is coming, the high gods have no moves left, because they embody the strong principles, the certainties of that culture, and that culture, it's not that there was no truth in it, it's that it can't hold anymore. Trickster is the one who manages to turn the thing into a joke, who manages to turn falling over from something to get angry about to something to laugh about. And Hine sort of traces this in the history of different cultures, from like ancient Greece to Iceland to, I don't know, the trickster figure within the mythology seems somehow to be central to the moment where there's a traumatic rupture and something new has to come along. And I feel like that might be true to the roles that those of us who get to call ourselves artists some of the time might be asked to play, and why those roles might become more important in a different way in a time when a world is ending and something new has to be born than they seem to be during times when people can act as if everything's going along just fine.
For me, there's a big problem between Western view of an end, so a life comes to an end, and alternative cultures that see, like say, reincarnation. There's a massive difference between how you deal with your environment. If you think, like, that's it, one off, boom, I'm gone, and nothing matters, nihilism or whatever, and the plant thing, plant grows, it dies, it dissolves, and then it manifests back again because it provides the growing surface for something else to grow. So there's a continuity, there's an ending, but every ending, as the dissolution is to providing the energy, then provide something. So like those old heat things where the bubbles used to go up and down and that. There's an enormous difference, and that's the shift that has to happen in that mentality thing, the paradigm. There has to be some addressing of those, because that's where the real issue is. In my view, that's the internal struggles my psyche rests with. Is
nothing disappears, everything changes, something's transformed, transmutation to something else.
Except my mind used to be rigid. I used to feel that I saw things that were factual, and like there was black and white. I believed in black and white, and then something I started doing arts and that, and something had to crack because I had an absolute certainty that the world was a certain way, and then I had to have a mental breakdown to handle it because it didn't square with another way of looking at when you. It's really helpful though, because you stop being afraid of death, But then everything you're dealing with, like, you feel that you're an alien, or I feel mostly that the language that I'm having to use is insufficient for the task.
I liked what you said, the language is insufficient for the task.
Well, that's how it feels.
It feels like that to me too. And I work with words, so yeah. Yes, but maybe part of it is a kind of composting. Maybe, like, we mustn't ever get too hung up on one particular image. Like, hospicing can be helpful in one way, but sometimes it can get us stuck. Composting is another language that I hear a lot of different people using to talk about endings out of which new things grow.
But if you feel crap is dirty, then you're stuck as well, because who wants to compost? Who wants to be? We all want to be the flower, don't we? I was saying that earlier, No one wants to be the insect or the full of, like.
I bet there's someone here who wants to be the insect, right?
Okay, great, thank you. And it's a real privilege to have you all here, and thank you to NewBridge for hosting us. And it's been a really powerful conversation and an emotional conversation. And thank you, Dougald, for bringing these words to us in the room. And we hope you go on to further solidarities with other humans, with other species. And as our world ends, new worlds beckon, and somehow we'll salvage something of our lives that will persist into the future.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Martyn.